a time tunnel. Face the incredible dangers of the past, or the unknown secrets of the future.
It's Woody Wing time! It's Woody Wing time! Hold it!
About a month ago, I posted a video discussing whether Woodrow Wilson was a bigot. In that video, I briefly mentioned how Wilson, who was a proto-neoliberal Democrat, had his political rival, Eugene Debs, thrown into prison. Though not many good Catholics would have supported Debs because he was a socialist, Debs received almost 1 million votes, which was 3.4% of the total voting, and he did this from his prison cell. Debs had been found guilty of violating a seemingly unconstitutional law called the Espionage Act of 1917. Interestingly, modern-day neoliberals have charged former President Donald Trump of violating this very same law. Under the Wilson administration, if anyone was critical of the war effort during the First World War, or even critical of the purchase of so-called Liberty bonds which funded the war, they could be charged with violating the law. It is interesting to note that while Wilson was president, at least 4 Catholic priests were charged with trumped-up charges under the Espionage Act. Let's look more closely at each of them. Father Michael D. Collins was a noted writer and lecturer. He had served as a special correspondent for the New York Sun and Associated Press, and in that capacity he traveled all over the world. Here's an article about Father Collins about 10 years before the First World War in 1907. At the risk of his life, Father Collins compelled the 5 saloons and dance halls of St. Mary's, Missouri, about 74 miles south of St. Louis, to close their doors at midnight on Saturday and keep them closed until midnight Sunday, and this would be an effort to keep the Lord's Day holy. The courageous priest had been shot at from ambush, had been threatened with tar and feathers, and was boycotted by members of his own congregation until his meager salary was in arrears. When the Missouri governor came at his invitation to speak at the church picnic, enemies of the priest kept many away by spreading a report that the governor would not come. But still, there were 5,000 at the picnic, and there was applause for the governor when he praised Father Collins for his hard-won victory for law enforcement. But then came the First World War, and the St. Louis Globe-Democrat reported that a federal grand jury indicted 17 persons on espionage charges, and a Catholic priest was among them. The Topeka Journal reported that a Catholic priest was arrested and charged with causing insubordination and disloyalty. Father Collins, a Catholic priest in Jackson, Missouri, for whom an indictment was returned by a federal grand jury, surrendered to a deputy of the United States Marshal and was placed under arrest. The indictment charged Father Collins with having caused insubordination and disloyalty by remarks made in July. He was released on a bond of $2,000. Fortunately for Father Collins, the war ended 7 months later and the charges were dropped. Interestingly, the second priest charged with espionage, Father Charles Einig, was also from the Cape Girardeau, Missouri area. Perhaps he received more scrutiny because he had a German name. At the time, Father Einig was 42 years old. According to this article, he was a powerfully built man with exceedingly broad shoulders and remarkable muscular development for one of his calling. He spoke with a pronounced German accent. He obtained his theological education at Kendrick Seminary in St. Louis and at Quincy College. His fellow clergymen said he was an exceptionally brilliant student of theology, and he had been an accomplished linguist. He had been a pastor at his parish for 9 years. Here it says that Father Einig was arrested at his home on a federal warrant charging him with making disloyal remarks. It was alleged that he made statements reflecting on the Liberty bonds and the American Red Cross. He had to post a bond of $2,000. The charges against Father Einig were eventually dropped after the war. However, later when he was 62 years old, in the midst of the Great Depression, 2 armed men broke into his rectory and tried to rob him. Evidently, in 1938, Father Einig was still a muscular man because he was able to push both of them out the front door. However, one of the men turned around and then shot and murdered Father Einig. The third priest who was charged was Father Ferdinand Schwetken. He was a priest who was born in Germany but came to America, where he served as pastor of a mostly German-speaking parish. His brother served in the United States Army during the First World War. Because he was a pastor of a German-speaking parish, his sermons and gospel readings were often given in German. With the coming of the war, that activity suddenly seemed to be suspicious to some. And then in 1918, he was charged with espionage. Father Schwetkin was charged with interfering in the sale of Liberty bonds. It was alleged that Father Schwetkin had told his congregation that bonds for a new Omaha Catholic cathedral were better than Liberty bonds because they paid more dividends. He was charged with having said that church bonds represented the poor man, while Liberty bonds represented the rich scoundrel. I couldn't confirm the final disposition of the charges, but it appears that they were eventually dropped. The fourth priest to be indicted also had a German name, Father William Windolf. Like Father Schwetkin, he was from the Omaha, Nebraska area. So it seems likely that a single prosecutor brought the charges against both Father Einig and Father Collins in the Cape Girardeau area, and also another single prosecutor brought the charges against Father Schwetkin and Father Windolf. So why were two prosecutors specifically picking out Catholic priests when the rest of prosecutors in the entire country were leaving priests be? Perhaps they were just overzealous, but as you recall, this was a time of great power by the Ku Klux Klan, and there was a great deal of anti-Catholic bigotry. My guess is that, like Woodrow Wilson, they were both anti-Catholic bigots. This was written up by our Sunday Visitor. It says that Father Windolf was accused of violating the Espionage Act by making certain injudicious utterances. He had to post a $5,000 bond for his appearance, and Father Windolf declared that he was the victim of spite work. The case against Father Windolf was pursued more vigorously than the other cases. The prosecution attacked the priest's character. He was accused of making seditious statements. He was charged with calling the United States soldiers cowards, and that the war was started by a few rich men. Other counts charging the priest was attempting to cause the disloyalty, insubordination, mutiny, obstruction to recruiting, and enlistments in service, and he was accused of uttering disloyal remarks. The prosecution tried to introduce anonymous letters that were sent out in large numbers through the mail, attacking the character of Father Windolf, and they suggested that he had had an improper relation with the nun at the parochial school. Since most of the charges against Father Windolf were shown to be ridiculous at face value, most of them were dropped. After removing the questionable testimony, it left the jury with only two alleged seditious statements. It was alleged that he said the United States was rotten and that the draft law was unconstitutional. Ultimately, the jury found in favor of Father Windolf, but it wasn't before his character had been thoroughly attacked in the newspapers. Here's a somewhat related story. Father Heinlein, another priest with a German name, who was pastor of Our Lady of Victory, had to post a $1,000 cash bail. The priest was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. Policeman Riley took him in when a crowd collected in front of the rectory after the alleged failure of the priest to ring the church bells in honor of a big victory of Our Boys Over There. So it seems that Father Heinlein was actually the victim of a mob who was accosting him, yet the police arrested him instead of the mob. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back again in about a week with another one, but in the meantime, please pray for the church.